So, just not so tall. Thank you very much, Pranab, for your kind words. I also want to begin by thanking the faculty and students of the National Institute of Juridical Sciences and the Ministry of External Affairs for making it possible for me to be here. My name is Neelam Dev, and I work with, I co-founded Gateway House, which is a foreign policy think tank in Mumbai. I've actually spent 4 months in Kolkata in the mid-70s. So it was very interesting to come back, and I went to the Kali Mandir yesterday just to get a sense of how the city has changed. Of course, the old city hasn't changed at all. And but Salt Lake City was not even an idea when I first came here. So in that sense, everything has changed. For me, those few months in it was then Calcutta, were very interesting, and as it turned out, they were also very useful, because later on I headed the division which deals with Bangladesh and Myanmar and also Sri Lanka and Maldives. But having spent those few months in Kolkata, I felt better prepared, and in fact worked then with the government of West Bengal in the work we did with Bangladesh. So it's a pleasure to be back here. But also when one looks at the changes that have taken place, it's really mind-boggling actually how much change there has been in West Bengal, in India, but also globally. And that really is what I want to talk to you about today, which is to identify some of the trends which are visible around us in what is changing. And in these, of course, perhaps the rise of China is the most outstanding, which we see the scale, the speed of the rise of China, and how that has changed the global matrix. So as China was rising and the United States was going through a relative decline, what are the changes? Then we must take into account the fact that China was not the only country which has risen. So India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Nigeria, a number of other countries as well, and how this shift, what difference this makes, this whole shift makes. I'm also going to touch on the fact that because so much change took place, there is a need for the institutions of global governance, like the UN Security Council, like the IMF, World Bank, like the World Trade Organization, to also change, and whether they are in fact changing or not. Mostly they are not changing. We want to look also at other trends, how much more salience religion has in public life and in political life than it used to, say, 20 years ago. This is another new factor today. The fall in the price of oil also changing the whole global situation. Technology. But technology not only in terms of the smartphone, which everybody knows what difference that makes in social interaction, but also in political mobilization, the Arab Spring movements. But at the same time, we also need to see how technology changes the processes of manufacturing. So, at one shift actually transferred a lot of manufacturing eastward, so whether to China. But the shifts that are underway now are actually transferring it back to developed countries. All of this kind of thing. So we're going to try and see how these new trends intersect with each other, and also what impact they have on India, how India is both a participant in some of these trends, but also the object, like what is happening to the country, its foreign policy, etc. Before actually going to these specific trends, I do want to point out also that there are a number of even more fundamental trends, changes which are happening but on which nobody has any, well, it's not correct to say that nobody has any control, but certainly nothing is happening there. So climate change, for instance, is one of the most important changes underway. And climate change impacts so many other trends, whether it is, the status of women, for instance, or whether it is what's happening with religion, what's happening with technology. All of these are intersecting also with climate change. So just to give you one example over there, the water scarcity that is happening and what is happening in the way the world's population has grown, water scarcity is becoming a cause of war. So the most prominent example these days is of Syria, where 7 years of drought led to a lot of people from the countryside, a lot of farmers, moving into the cities because of the rural despair that they were undergoing, and which became the sort of trigger for the civil war. Of course, everybody then got into it, everyone got into support different factions. The West has consistently interfered in this region because of its oil wealth, but it started with a water issue. And we know this very well in India because we look at rural distress in India and we see everything that happens from that. Water is a big issue also between India and all our neighbors. So India and Bangladesh over the sharing of the Ganga waters, India and Pakistan over the sharing of the Indus River waters, India's concerns over China damming the Brahmaputra. And you can see that the opposite discourse between Bhutan and Nepal on the use of their water resources to generate hydroelectricity. Bhutan has become the richest country in South Asia because it has allowed India to build power stations from its water resources and sell the electricity to India. Nepal is the poorest because it has not tried to develop its hydro resources in collaboration with India, which would invest in building the dams, generating the resources, and then buy the electricity, as we do with Bhutan. So all of these are the kind of trends that we have to try to understand which ones operate with a higher profile at any one time, which ones are less important. There are other things which are happening, again, like the change in the status of women. So 70 years ago in India, when we became independent, women were given the right to vote but had no other rights. There was no property rights, for instance, for women. But if you look in a global sense, in 70 years, the fact that women today have an equal right to family property, it's a huge change that has taken place. But at the same time, there are so many ways in which women continue to be discriminated. But all of these also play into international relations. They play into the whole discourse of human rights, for instance. When women's rights are not afforded, then human rights are not. In a war, women and children are the primary victims of those wars. So there will be all of these even more underlying trends which are playing out globally. So if we come back to just looking at the 3 or 4 which I want to identify, and that is the rise of China. In 30 years since 1979, when China announced an economic opening, it has since then become the second largest economy in the world. Its economy is now valued at approximately $10 trillion. And then you compare it with the United States of America, which took 200 years to become the largest economy in the world, which is now a value of $17.4 trillion. But in purchasing power parity terms, China is already a larger economy than the United States of America. Now you can argue whether purchasing power parity is a good measure or not, and the Americans of course argue that if you want to buy a Boeing plane, then you have to pay in dollars, not in rupees or in yuan. That's true. But how many planes do we buy? When I buy a plate of rice and curry, that's what counts for me. and for most of the citizens. So purchasing power parity is a very important thing, and India already is the third largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity. We are already almost as large as Italy and will be surpassing the economy of France and the UK in the next couple of years to become the fourth largest economy after the US, China, Germany, and then it will be India. So all of these are major changes that are taking place. But the Chinese in this 30-year period grew so rapidly, and they had double-digit growth, 50% annual rate of saving, more than 50% annual rate of investment, so they were able to build up an infrastructure which boosted the rate of growth immensely. But importantly for international relations, China became the biggest trading partner of most countries in the world, including India in commodities, not total trade. It became the biggest investor in most countries of the world. So these give you a degree of influence in the country of which you are the biggest trading partner, where it has now substituted the kind of influence that the United States of America had, or in an earlier period the United Kingdom had, or France had. If you look at the fact that its defense budget has grown from just $10 billion in 1990, it has grown to $145 billion in this 15-year period. It's a phenomenal increase. So even though the American budget is still 5 times larger than the Chinese defense budget, what it means is that the United States of America can no longer force China to do what it wants to do. And you see that in the disturbances that are going around with the regions and those issues that China regards as core interest for itself. Similarly, you can see that in the case of India, if we do an India-China comparison, so the Indian economy is $2 trillion. That is 1/5 the size of the Chinese economy. So you have to understand the rhetoric, including on differences that we have with China on the border, keeping in mind the size of the Indian economy. The Indian defense budget is $40 billion. The Chinese is $145 billion, and that is only their official figures. Everybody believes that the actual budget may well be larger, but that gives you a sense of how these international equations are these days, and therefore you have to also determine what your policy in these matters can be. But there are also other big economies, whether it's Russia at $1.5 trillion, or Nigeria, or Brazil. And because what is called the rise of the East, or the rise of the rest versus the United States and other developed economies, this has made so many changes that it has also called into question the existing international, the institutions of global governance around the world. And that means that are those institutions which are now under so much pressure, are they changing or are they not changing? And if we look at these, we will find that although China, because it has become such a big economy, is now exerting its military muscle in the region around it, so the South China Sea is a big flashpoint, or with India on the India-China border. This is a border where the Chinese are not willing to engage in any constructive way towards a resolution, maybe because they are waiting for when the situation will be even more favorable, more in their favor, to get a line which they feel is in their interest. Of course, it depends. Tibet is the real big issue between India and China, and that is why this border has not been demarcated. So these are the sort of things we have to play out. But it's not only India, China. It's also China with the United States. It's China and Japan. So Japan has had to change its own political postures as well. And what has Japan done? Japan has amended its post-war constitution, which was a peace constitution, which did not allow Japanese defense forces, they're not even actually allowed an army, they are called self-defense forces, to now be able to fight outside of the Japanese mainland. This is exactly what Germany did when the problems began in the Balkans, when you had the war all over Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. They also amended their constitution to be able to go outside the territory of Germany. So this competition, the nature of the competition has changed. The unipolar moment, when the United States was the biggest power, which it remains, but it had no challenge. So the United States and NATO could decide what will happen all over the world up to a point, because of course local politics always plays a big part in this. So what is happening today is that there are issues on which the United States and China actually do cooperate. For instance, they cooperated in the question of the nuclear agreement with Iran, the permanent 5 members. The United States and China have begun to cooperate on a resolution in Afghanistan, for instance. There is this 4-power meetings now. But China has not cooperated with the United States and NATO countries over their face-off with Russia over Ukraine. It does not cooperate with the Western countries over investment and trade with Zimbabwe or with other African countries, where the Western countries are losing influence to China and they want China actually to follow their example. Now, why would it? If you become the biggest investor, the biggest trader, in every sense the biggest, then why would you? So what we have to consider is that in this situation where China has become sort of equal to the United States of America globally, the way Russia, the Soviet Union, used to be equal to the United States of America in the Cold War period. So what does India have to do? India has begun to lean west. It has begun to balance its relationships with other countries in order to balance China and to counter what we regard as a Pakistan-China nexus. And these are very important shifts that India is undertaking, because we had begun our policy of non-alignment even before our independence. We had begun to conceptualize that policy. So at present, there are really 2 big trends in India's positioning globally. One is that we have been an active member of the BRICS forum. That is a forum which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which joined later on. Sometimes BRICS cooperates in the sense that we have been cooperating to try to change the vote share in the IMF and the World Bank. At other times, some of the BRICS countries have cooperated, as India and China cooperated on climate change issues in the earlier summit in Copenhagen, or where India and Russia cooperate. So in some areas we cooperate, but we give a lot of importance to the BRICS forum. And it was the Indian Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who had suggested the setting up of a BRICS bank, a new development bank, which actually has been set up. At the same time, we have moved away from the policy of non-alignment because this policy began to not serve our interest after 1989, when the Soviet Union was dissolved and Russia became the successor state, but it also, a lot of new countries emerged. So, and very soon thereafter began the dissolution of Yugoslavia, in which the West took a lot of interest because it's also geographically close to them. So from there, we started to work to improve relations with the United States and to also have a more intense exchange with European countries like the UK, France, Germany, all of whom had been important trading partners for us. But what this government has done, 2 things have happened. One is, of course, the most important shift was the signing of a nuclear energy agreement with the United States of America in 2003 by the Manmohan Singh government, which ended a period of what we used to call nuclear apartheid in India and made high technology, particularly American, accessible to Indian companies and to the Indian government. Also, high-tech weapons, which the US had not earlier wanted to sell India. Now, of course, it's pressurizing India to buy those. So, but this is being taken further at a faster pace by the Modi government, which has signed a joint vision agreement with the United States of America. It has signed a similar agreement with Japan. It has signed a similar agreement with Australia. And the purpose of this agreement is to try to keep the sea lanes for international trade in the South China Sea open, to keep a balance with how much China tries to come into the Indian Ocean. So these are agreements in the Indo-Pacific, what is being called the Indo-Pacific area. At the same time, India has upped its Look East policy, which is to say that we are trying and have actually had some success in becoming closer to the countries in Southeast Asia, which are having a more productive relationship with China in terms of economic growth, but are seeking a balance with India and with the United States in there to balance bullying by the Chinese in the South China Sea, or like for Japan in the Sea of Japan, or as we feel on our border. So those are the kind of balancing situations that other countries have also taken. The Southeast Asian countries as well as Japan, by amending its constitution, by starting to offer to export defense items to India, to Vietnam, to the Philippines, etc. These are all new trends, again set off in one sense by the rise of China, but also by the decline of the United States of America, on which these countries, particularly Japan, had depended for their security. They are security allies, but they have had to recognize that the United States no longer can be a dependable ally against China if they were to get into a fighting war with China, which everybody is hoping that they won't. But in the meantime, what is happening to the global governance institutions? And here we can just try to just look at them very quickly to see that. So there are political governance institutions like the United Nations. The UN Security Council, of course, was set up in 1945 after the end of the Second World War in that sector, but the Pacific sector continued till 1947, till our independence actually. So two things happened at the time. One is that Indian independence meant the end of the colonial period, the European colonies, because very soon, around the same time, Indonesia became independent. Soon after that, Nigeria, Ghana, most countries within the next 10 years or so became independent countries. But the Security Council was set up by the victors of the Second World War. So that is to say, it was the United States of America, UK, France. They had to bring in the Soviet Union, with which they had allied and which actually took most of the casualties of that war. And they put Taiwan. China was to be included in the Security Council, but by then China had become a communist country, and the United States of America refused to even have diplomatic relations with China, did not recognize China as a country, and did not want another communist country inside the Security Council. So Taiwan occupied that seat, which was the KMT government. Now, it has never been modified 65, almost 70 years afterwards, to reflect the fact that the UK and France are no longer world powers. Germany is a much bigger economy and a much more important European country, especially after the reunification of Germany. India has a claim to be a member of the Security Council because we are now the third largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity. We have a large army. We have participated in all UN peacekeeping operations all over the world. And we are certainly, in a global sense, more significant and should be treated more significantly than France, for example, which is no longer of any significance and is actually in playing a very negative role in its former colonies, particularly in Africa. The UK now is not a consequential country because even though it still has a larger economy, but the largest employer in the manufacturing sector in the UK is Tata's. So you can see how things have changed, but how these things are not being taken into account. Because they are not taken into account, the UN Security Council is becoming irrelevant. Even those people, those countries which are members, are no longer going to the UN Security Council before they declare war under Chapter 7. Instead, they set up, as George Bush did, what they call coalitions of the willing. He wanted to invade Iraq because he felt his father had not invaded Iraq or whatever his reasons were. So a coalition of the like-minded coalition countries, which really means NATO countries, and then a few other countries there who feel themselves critically dependent on the United States, joined that, like Australia, for example, for the invasion of Iraq. Then, when the Libya question came up in the course of the Arab uprisings, there actually was a UN resolution, but only for an air defense situation, only to prevent the Libyan Air Force from being able to bomb. But in fact, that was used as an excuse to invade Libya, to kill the dictator there, Gaddafi. Therefore, when the problems in Syria began, the UN Security Council has been paralyzed. No member of the UN Security Council, like Russia or China, who are not part of NATO, are willing for the Security Council to undertake any kind of military action. So what do we have? We have members of the Security Council themselves declaring war and not bothering about the UN Security Council. Russia did the same. When it annexed the Crimea, it may have had good reasons to be offended and to try to resist what NATO was doing in the Ukraine. But annexing the Crimea is clearly against all international law. But nobody is able to do anything about it because the UN Security Council is no longer a functional institution. Germany should be there, Japan should be there. So we have this group of 4 which is seeking entry along with Brazil, Germany, Japan and India, and Africa. But the African countries are not able to arrive at a decision on who should be the African country which should join the Security Council. So that is held up. If you look at the economic institutions of global governance, which is the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, you find that they too have become more obviously tools of the United States of America and the developed Western countries. So what they do is to pursue those interests. So if you look at how much the loans that the IMF give to countries which are in financial difficulty, you will find that to Korea and Thailand in the 90s, when we had the Asian financial crisis, they gave around $20 billion each. And this was followed with a lot of conditions, monitoring of the economies of Thailand and South Korea. But when Europe began to be in trouble, when Portugal, Spain, Greece, when those countries came into problems, then you found that the IMF is giving loans which are incredible considering the size of the population. So Ireland, with a population of less than 5 million, was given 22.5 billion. More than Thailand with a population of 60 billion, or Korea with a population then of about 40 billion. Portugal with a population of 10 million was given 26 billion. Greece with a population of only 11 million has already been given $62 billion from the IMF. Plus it has received $94 billion from the European Central Bank. Now, is there any conceivable way that Greece with a population of 11 million is going to ever be able to repay $140 billion? Never. So all these loans will be written off. In the meantime, who has funded this? China has put in $43 billion into IMF funds. India has put in $10 billion. Brazil has put in some money. This because these are funds which have contributions from all countries. So we in India are funding the Greek bailout or the Portuguese bailout. The Chinese are funding those. But it has taken the IMF 6 years to change the voting rights of different countries depending upon the contributions they are making and the size of their economies. It took the US Congress 6 years to approve a change which reduced US voting rights by 0.02%. You know, and the increase in the Indian voting share has gone up by 0.02%. The case of China, slightly more the vote share is, but China has the same vote share and influence in the IMF as the Netherlands economy. You know, so there's no proportion, these are really inappropriate ways for these institutions to be run. Clearly China, India, Brazil, everyone should have more influence in these institutions. But what do you have? A tradition whereby the chief of the IMF is always a French, used to be a man, for the first time there's a woman. She's now finished her term and is seeking a second term. Now what will happen? The European countries and the United States will try to divide developing countries, as happened last time when she got elected. There was a Mexican candidate and a much better candidate, but they made a deal with the Chinese so that the Chinese got the number 2 position. And developing countries will make these deals, so it's not a big surprise. They will try it again. The chief of the World Bank is always an American. They now have a American of Korean origin, as if that is supposed to mean anything. He's an American citizen as far as the rest of the world is concerned and pursues American interests. So in the meanwhile, what's happening with climate change talks? You know, we have just had a meeting in last month in Paris. It was the 21st conference of the parties. At the end of this 2 weeks of argument, the result is that developed Western countries have said that despite their historical responsibility for creating the problem, they will not bear any burden. Developing countries like India, where one Indian consumes the same electricity as 1/40th of what an American consumes. So the American is consuming 4 times more power than an Indian. But we must all have the similar contributions to make, which are nationally determined. So everybody made nationally determined contributions that they would try to fulfill. Nobody will try to fulfill anything of the sort. Can you imagine that in India, where more than almost 60% of power is generated by coal, can suddenly switch off all those power stations, even though some 25-30% of the population still does not have access to electricity? Can we make that change? We will certainly try to increase the amount of alternate energy, so whether it is solar or hydro or wind energy or nuclear for that matter. But we're not going to turn off coal power. Today, actually, in if you don't do these comparisons, today more energy is generated in the United States of America using coal, thermal energy, than in India, because they consume 40 times more than each Indian. And when you look at the fact that there are 4 times more Indians than there are Americans, so we're actually talking about 160% more in the United States of America. And they are not cutting down on their coal use. So, but trying to pressure India. And how do they pressure India? These are all the connections that we have to try to understand. So, the American government announced that none of the aid it gives to any developing country can be used for thermal power, for power projects using coal, for coal-fired power projects. 1 month later, the World Bank announced that none of the aid the World Bank gives can be used for coal-powered power plants anywhere in the world. So if developing countries had more influence in the World Bank, they could influence what the World Bank's policy on these kinds of aid contributions would be. But it doesn't. The US has a veto on that. The US decides what the World Bank's, where and how the World Bank's aid will be used. You had a similar, so what we have from Paris and climate change is actually the single most important, the most dangerous trend underway today. At the end, everybody agreed that they will put in these voluntary offers, and there will be some kind of review every 5 years. But there is no there is no way to check what any country does. And the history has been that all the undertakings that developed countries had undertaken, which had legal force in the Kyoto Agreement, were not fulfilled by developed countries. There's nothing you can do about it. So in the end, we have an agreement, we have an understanding where everybody said it's very important that we all do something so that there is not more than 2% rise in global temperatures, because then you have a catastrophe globally. We already actually have a catastrophe, but there is no way to make sure that that will happen, because the developed countries will neither reduce their share of what is becoming carbon space, what is called for, nor will they assist developing and poor countries to adapt their economies or to mitigate the effects of climate change, which can already be seen in the kind of extreme weather events that are taking place all over the world. You have the same situation in the World Trade Organization, which met in Nairobi, and it was announced that the Doha round is over because all countries have to reduce their tariffs in the same proportions. That developing countries do not have any special claim on developed countries, despite all the damage done to their economies under colonization and by the policies of the IMF, World Bank, etc. in the past. So at the end of that meeting, it was announced that the old understandings are finished, no more. As soon as that meeting was over, all the rich capitalist sort of chief executive officers of all the big multinationals all went to Davos. And on the 23rd of January, on the sidelines of the Davos discussions, a meeting was held of 22 finance ministers of rich countries who announced that henceforth they would do trade negotiations among themselves. Actually, you can already see it happening in the mega trade agreements that have been announced. So there has been what is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has the United States of America, Australia, and a number of other Pacific countries, and Japan, but not China, not India. They have already signed an agreement. Another agreement which is being negotiated is between the US and Europe. That will be the Transatlantic Partnership Pact. The Chinese are spearheading what they call a RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Economic Program. India is a part of those negotiations, but we don't know how that will proceed, and it is believed that China is considering actually joining the TPP already, if Japan will let it come in, etc., etc. So trade agreements are being arrived at which exclude developing and poorer countries. So whether it is India, whether it is Nigeria, whether it is young people are the greatest users, it's become a sort of echo chamber. You go to those sites where you will affirm your own opinion and most opinions come out of prejudices of one sort or another. It's also the tool for recruitment for Islamist movements at the moment. But it's also a even bigger tool for propaganda for Western and particularly the English language media, because the internet for the longest time was available only in English. So everybody looked at those sites. Finally, just to say 2 words on what's happening in South Asia, which of course is impacted by everything that happens around it, but equally what happens in South Asia impacts the rest of the world. Just like the 9/11 bombings in New York were planned and funded out of Pakistan by mostly Saudi insurgents. So these are all interacting things. What you find is that in Pakistan today, after the Peshawar killings, when 140 young school kids were murdered by a terrorist organization, the people of Pakistan have turned against the policy of the government to use terrorism as a matter of state policy. But this is neither not going to be easy, it's not going to be a smooth process either. But you contrast it with Bangladesh. Bangladesh is trying to recover the secular ethos of its independence struggle, which was based on language and culture. And that is not an easy process either. You have had the killing of bloggers who were rationalists. You have had the Jamaat-e-Islami bring out these huge crowds onto the streets. When they found, convicted people of crimes of genocide during the War of Independence, when 3 million Bangladeshis were killed, some 60 to 80,000 women were raped as a matter of policy by the Pakistan Army and its local collaborators. In those convicting those criminals, but it can always be projected badly because everyone is saying, including Western human rights organizations, it is her father. And it's true, Sheikh Hasina's father was the father of the nation. He and his family were butchered. But the country has to have a reckoning in order to be able to move ahead. You find similar problems. Maldives, little Maldives is turning into a kind of, the amount of drug use, 100 people out of a population of less than 1 million are actually have joined the Islamic State. I mean, this is an extraordinary level of politicization in these countries. So finally, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the old Hindu story of Samudra Manthan. It's the great churning, and with this churning, the poison that came to the top had to be swallowed by Shiva before the gods could partake of the nectar. So we have a huge churning going on. It is generating major instability globally. The Middle East is really in flames, and everyone will be sucked into this kind of thing unless we are able to deal with it wisely and take account of today's reality to shape the global governance institutions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderfully illuminating lecture that mapped all geopolitical and geoeconomic trends that have happened in the last 1 year and their impact on India's external policy. Could we now have a question and answer? We would now like to open the floor to Q&A, and anyone willing to ask questions, please raise your hands. Start.
For the rise of multinational corporations, how they are actually going to be supposed to be reckoned with. For example, the TPP was manufactured or created by mostly multinational institutions, and it was out of the hands of the governments and the people to even read these agreements, to understand them before they could move on. So similarly, is this rise of multinational corporations, which are now becoming so big and powerful that governments cannot control them, going to become a big threat? For example, right now in ISIS, one of the biggest ways that we could have eliminated them was to eliminate all their oil assets. But because these were owned by the US and their multinational corporations, they're not even being targeted to be destroyed. So are these sort of interests now going to be detrimental to the world?
No two corporations are exactly the same. They do have similar agendas. So one of the things in the TPP which has been lobbied against, or at least spoken against, is the international disputes tribunals. Now those tribunals, very shady, nobody knows how they are going to be set up. But a multinational corporation can take a government there, and the Australians actually have made the most noise on this, because they have been sued by R.J. Reynolds, by Philip Morris, because they tried to adopt policies to reduce smoking by putting those warnings on the thing. So Philip Morris said that as a result of those policies, we have lost so much in profit, and that can actually be arbitrated. And the tribunal, depending on who it is and what their inclinations are, may actually say yes, the government of Australia has to pay Philip Morris for the profits that it may have lost. Now, this is, it is ludicrous that a government, a country cannot have a health policy which cannot be challenged. Or for instance, we have had all these repeated cases in the IPR issues, which I hope some of you are studying also and will become experts on. That Tulsi can be patented by an American company, or haldi, or basmati rice, but you cannot call your sparkling wine champagne because the French have a patent on that, or they have the IPR right. So who makes the rules, of course, is very important. That is why there is this big search for trying to be in the bodies that make the rules. That's why you want to be influential in the World Trade Organization or the IMF, World Bank, or the UN Security Council, because you need to be there when the rules are made. All the rules were made earlier by people whose only experience was Western, and of course all those rules suited them, and they don't want to change any of those rules. So you have to become big enough. And one way that you are trying to become big enough is by the creation of an alternate financial architecture. So whether it is the New Development Bank, whether it is the Asian Infrastructure Bank, Investment Bank, whether it is the fund that the Chinese have set up to promote their One Belt, One Road projects. Of course, the Chinese have their own interests, just like the Americans had their interests with World Bank policies. But what will happen is that the Americans will no longer be a monopoly. You may have a duopoly for a while, because no other country comes even close to the size of the American and the Chinese economies. And that is why everyone is looking at India, because it is one of the few countries that has the potential to grow that big. Russia or Brazil may have been bigger economies than India 5 years ago, but they could never challenge China. But India eventually will. But today India's economy is 1/5 the size of China. So that is only how much you can challenge. But if you are able to create even 3 banks like this, and even if they have paid up capital of $200 billion, then you have broken a monopoly. And that is the only way that you can proceed on this. The power of multinational corporations is such, as I said, the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett together have an NGO which has nearly $1 trillion. Of course, who can make health policy? And that it's not just that they look at HIV and malaria eradication. They are big supporters of pharmaceutical patents. And pharmaceutical patents, everybody knows, is the biggest scam. That every 10 years you can modify slightly the delivery mechanism, and then it will be treated as a new drug with a 20-year period, and then etc. So countries must break those laws. Countries like India, because we have a big generic industry, there is a motive here also. So yes, you do it for self-interest, but it also breaks a global monopoly. And the multinational corporations, yes. So that is why they have all set up India offices. That's why they are not operating only from there. But they don't pay taxes anywhere. So the British, after this long and public noise, I think Facebook is going to pay $173 million in back taxes. $173 million on profits which ran to billions. So as I think Modi said recently, that double taxation avoidance treaties become treaties whereby these corporations pay tax in neither country, not here and not there either. So yeah, you have to be vigilant, and you are all with your training, you will understand how every comma and every clause matters in the agreements that you sign.
Thank you, ma'am, for your speech. I have 2 questions. The first being that what is your opinion on India's recent role in the Nepal crisis, and I mean, how wise was India's move to block those border and customs ports between India and Nepal during this crisis? Because as a fallout, I would say that we've almost lost Nepal as a result of this for a crisis that was largely internal, and which I don't know how much of an effect it had on the Indian landscape. That's my first question. The second being that in light of the one road, one belt policy that China is following, India has not been part of the negotiations that are going on, whereby China is engaging with a number of Central Asian and South Asian countries to join in on this program. To counter this, India doesn't have a strong policy whereby it can almost have its parallel route. Yes, it has the Chabar port and ports across in Bangladesh and in the Indian Ocean region. But if we can't beat them, why can't we join them? Why isn't India taking a more proactive role to become a part of it? Or why should it not be a part of it au contraire? So
two things. One is on Nepal, of course. India did not blockade Nepal, notwithstanding all the propaganda that the Nepalese government, etc., have done. If you are a truck driver and there is an agitation going on, are you going to drive through that carrying oil? That's an important question. So that is actually what happened at the border. Was it an internal crisis only? You know that in the arrangements that India and Nepal have, it's an open border. Nepalis can work in India, Indians cannot work in Nepal. And the border population, the Madeshis, the districting was so fixed that they had their influence in the parliament was going to be nothing, despite promises made to them by the Nepali Congress and the communist parties, etc. So this was an agitation by the Madeshis. Is it of concern to India? Of course it's of concern to India. It's your border. It's your border with Bihar. It's your border to some extent, a little bit, with Uttar Pradesh. Then they had a provision, as most countries are, with their sort of male chauvinist situations. Children of Nepali women married to a foreigner, which is usually an Indian, will not have Nepali citizenship. But children of a Nepali man married to a foreign woman will have citizenship. Now, in today's day and age, you are enacting a new constitution and you bring in a provision like this, you should be laughed out of court, and it's extraordinary that that people think there is a question on this, that it's an internal matter, that women's rights are always either a domestic problem or an internal matter. So if you beat your wife, it's not a thing for the police to do anything about, but if you beat a man outside on the street, then the police should come in. So that kind of situation cannot prevail. I think the government of India did the right thing. As it happened, it also had a political interest because there were elections in Bihar. So these things are never going to be separated. Anyone who thinks that countries do not do things just like that for altruistic reasons, no, they don't. Nobody does, and certainly not government of India. Have we lost the Nepalis? Yeah, I mean, but there has always been propaganda against India in the Nepali elites. If you look at India, it was the Indian elite which didn't like the United States of America. All the normal people wanted to go and live there, till the elite decided that all their children having been gone to colleges in the United States of America, it's better that we have a better relationship, and therefore supported the Manmohan Singh government when they tried to change really make a big shift in the relationship. I think you have to remember that, and one must understand what are elite interests and how those are propagated, and how the interests at the bottom. Something like 8-9% of the budget of the Nepal government goes as pensions to Gurkhas who have served in the Indian army. So Nepalis serve in the Indian army and with great distinction. But we are not supposed to take an interest in what happens in Nepal. It's never going to happen like that. Today, yes, they may be using the China card, but they have always used the China card. India has always been a factor in elite politics in Nepal. Just as India used to be a factor in elite politics in Pakistan, till now the Peshawar killing has changed the whole discourse. people have started to say that this has nothing to do with India. We should not be nurturing these terrorist organizations. Or take Bangladesh. It was under this government of Sheikh Hasina, they see that their own interest lies in better relations with India. And they have stopped supporting terrorist organizations. You know, they have handed over all the leadership of ULFA, which the previous government had nurtured in Bengal. So whether it is Paresh Barua, Arabinda Rajakhoa, all of these big names which had kept it going. So now Government of India, of course, should be wise in the northeastern states and not be looking for trouble as maybe Arunachal Pradesh these days. But what happens in your neighboring country is always going to be of concern. You can never take this kind of detached stand on that. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
It was about the Silk Route, the one.
Yeah, the One Belt, One Road is a purely Chinese project. They haven't discussed it with anybody. So nobody, I think that's one of the Indian positions. Talk to us, tell us what the idea is. So what is happening with the OBOR is that the part that is most coherent and is being built is through Pakistan, to the Gwadar port. And it's going to transform the Pakistani economy if it happens. Because for the last 15 years, 20 years, the Chinese have been talking about investing in power plants. They start doing something, they build a little bit, they build a road, or they built the Islamabad, Lahore, that connection. But mostly, like not even 10% of previous aid promised, announced, everything actually was delivered to the Pakistanis. And in this project also, it's now supposed to be $45 billion, but it's a very doubtful point how much will be delivered. India is not part of Chinese plans for the OBOR. The only route is the Kunming to Calcutta port. We have to consider whether, when we know that the Chinese are raking up insurgencies in the northeastern states, whether that is necessarily in our best interest. But now that doesn't mean that Government of India should do nothing. We should be building, a parallel road. And for the first time, India has begun a policy where it has welcomed Japanese investment to link up all the northeastern states, along with the project that is underway from Myanmar, the Kaladan project, which is also a road and a rail project. But we must move. We've been talking about the Chabahar port for 15 years now. I haven't done anything. In fact, we started to do the Kaladan project while I was still a joint secretary for the Bangladesh-Myanmar division. And even today, it's, all those years later, it's so frustrating. We haven't gotten that far. So I don't think that we need to join the Chinese projects, but we do need to do our own projects with our neighbors and to improve connectivity. But at the same time, everyone is looking for a balancing policy. So Modi has traveled to China and had President Xi visit India, because we also want the Chinese to invest in Indian infrastructure. We will see how much they invest. Japan has actually invested. And whether the high-speed rail link is a good project or not, that must be assessed on its technological and cost measures. But Japan is the only country that has really made those big investments. Now we will see whether actually the British and the Americans and Singapore and everybody else invests in the smart cities projects that they have undertaken. We have to see. Please.
My question is related to the terrorist organizations which emerged from the Middle East. So what we recently saw was after the plane bombing in Egypt, the Russian plane bombing in Egypt by the ISIS. So immediately after that we had the Al Qaeda attack on the Burkina Faso hotel. So there we saw there's a kind of competitive terrorism that is happening where Al Qaeda is trying to remain in focus by kind of countering what the ISIS is doing. So how do we how do we actually stop that? Is there any way or any way we can tackle that? And my second question is related to the recent Pathankot attacks. So after the Pathankot attacks, we had so many commentators saying different things. So is it correct to say that India and Pakistan should always keep on engaging in talks, because that is the best way we keep the Western powers out of like out of discussions as far as India and Pakistan are concerned.
So on the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIL at the moment, the Islamic State, because the Islamic State, is too violent even by comparison with Al-Qaeda, so people are attracted to that. Now, Islamic State is demanding that all these other terrorist organizations must owe their allegiance to them because they are the caliphate. They have revived the Ottoman Caliph. Most have already said so, like Boko Haram in Nigeria and many of the others. Al-Qaeda is still hoping to be, independent. I think the only way that you fight these organizations, not by the bombings, etc., which Western countries are doing in Syria. They are pretending to fight Islamic State and actually bombing up Syria. Now, you destroy a country like that, what is going to be the outcome? I mean, what do people do? This part of the world, also demography is again an important global and cross-cutting issue. There are these millions of unemployed young men. They don't have a good education, they have no future prospects. What are they going to do? I mean, what will a young man in Afghanistan do? What is his choice? Earlier he used to work for the NATO and American military conglomerations. Now that those are going away, the only job available is to join the Taliban. So of course you have seen a resurgence in the Taliban. What is a person going to do? What is their training? Long ago farming operations were disrupted. So now, people don't even know how to farm anymore. So those are the real issues. As for India, I think in India, if we can maintain our own, cultural traditions and Hindu-Muslim amity and coexistence, then we will not become major victims to terrorist organizations which are homegrown. We will continue to be a victim of terrorism planned from Pakistan as long as Pakistan itself doesn't change. Pakistan has to recognize that you've had this other attack on the Bacha Khan University, not as horrible as the Peshawar school attack, but how long can a society sustain that their own children are now become targets of these kinds of organizations? So people in Pakistan have to oppose their own army's policies.
But there's generally a counter narrative in Pakistan that most of these attacks, whether it was on this Bacha Khan University or the attack on the school in Peshawar, so that is why that is what RAW or the Indian intelligence agencies do. So in countering whatever force Pakistan is using. So it's not an easy thing to do, to counter that counter narrative that is there in Pakistan.
Well, the counter narrative that the Pakistanis put out, the ISI puts out, is that it was an Indian planned attack, etc. But I think in the end people are not so stupid. I think including here, I mean, when you have an attack like Pathankot, you know that this has come from across the border, whether you belong to Indian intelligence or Indian government or not. But when there is some small thing happens somewhere else, then you know that this has got to have a big homegrown element. But Punjab is the border. I mean, Pathankot is how many kilometers? 20 kilometers from the border. So I think most people have the sense to know what is what. They go along with the government narrative because it's not as if ordinary citizens every day of their lives can sit in dharna against their government. I mean, there are many complaints that Indian citizens would have against their government, but you have to also live your own life and do what you do. But nobody here, I think, that people will know when there has been a attack which is homegrown. What happened in Bangalore, when that scientists conclave was attacked, I think most people understood that was a homegrown terrorist group. It was not from outside. It's like now, people in Burkina Faso or in Nigeria or somewhere else are not blaming their neighbors. They understand that these are terrorist notes which have been, sometimes they are completely domestic and have had no connection with Islamic State or Al-Qaeda for that matter. But they share that ideology. And in terrorist attacks and incidents, I think you have to also see that there's a kind of psychological factor here. There's a lot of imitation attacks soon after. it's just actually like suicides among young people, that one person will commit a suicide, and then there's a kind of imitation copycat suicides, what are called, and there's a lot of copycat in the terrorist outfits as well, because they each have to prove that they still exist, that they are influential, that they can, do this kind of thing in order to continue recruitment and to continue to gather their funds as well.
Recently, sanctions were removed from Iran. I mean, is it right that India has lost the opportunities which it could have used it earlier?
So, actually, the removal of sanctions from Iran is another very important trend, which we will see how it plays out. But in the 10 years that those talks went on, already it changed the Middle East. It made the Saudi government so afraid that it joined up with the Israelis to oppose the lifting of sanctions against Iran. Did India lose an opportunity? I think one has to understand that Iran is not a communist government. It's not like in the old days, government of India and the government of the Soviet Union did something. Iran is a free economy. There are many institutions like of the, all those military and semi-military organizations. They run institutions. But in general, trade, etc., is an open affair. So an Iranian company has to want to trade with an Indian company, and the Indian private sector has to have the energy and the nimbleness to also go in. But you don't lose opportunities. Nothing is forever in human affairs. Where did President Rouhani go first of all? He went to Italy and to France. So the Europeans were also saying earlier, why are we imposing sanctions? We will lose. Iran is an 80 million population. It's the third largest source of oil and gas in the world. It has a highly educated population. Before the sanctions were lifted, there were German companies in Iran trying to already put in place recruitment of Iranian technically trained people, engineers, technicians, whatever it is. So nothing is lost. We have to move. We have to see what our companies do. So it is for Tata Motors to go there and try to sell cars, not for the government of India. It is for Mahindra tractors to go and sell tractors to Iranian companies, or Bajaj to go and sell two-wheelers. So, but they may enter in like other people, like you yourselves. They also yearn for American and European products, which may or may not have a higher quality, but that is what is aspirational, including for the Iranians. So if you have the money, you will buy an iPhone, not a whatever is the other equivalents of it. So certainly they will do that. But just as Samsung is able to have a higher market share in India than Apple has, then it is for an Indian company to go and work for a share of that market. And don't forget that even under sanctions, Iran was like the second or third largest producer and exporter of cement. So Iran is not a virgin territory in that sense. Iran has a big industry of its own. Now you have to tap into it. You have to move on building the Chabahar port, for instance. Only now has the government of India appropriated almost $100 million for that port, which has been in discussion for 20 years. Okay. Sorry.
You talked about how climate change is impacting the various trends, and you said it impacts the status of women. So can you give us an instance of the same?
Yeah.
And one more question. You talked about this story of the churning of this ocean.
Yeah.
So you have referred to the present day context and the scenario, and you said that nectar that came out before the other gods could take the nectar. One god, Shiva, had to take in all of the poison. And you compared this poison to the instability that is there present around in the world. But when all the countries are themselves contributing to this instability, so who do you think is going to come forward to take in all the instability so that there is peace around in the world?
good question, and there's no very clear answer to many of these. So first of all, if you just look at the women's question, so whether it is, if the rise of religion, the salience of religion, it immediately has an impact on the status of women, because all religions in the world give a lower status to women. So the more fundamentalist Hindus become, or the more fundamentalist Muslims become, or Christians for that matter, the impact on the role of women is immediate. Women are pushed back home, they are only supposed to look after children, serve the husband, all that kind of thing. So that's what happens with religion. With climate change, for instance, if you just go back to the water example which I gave, the more the scarcity of water, the more time women will spend in, say, Rajasthan to go and fetch water. The less that there is water for agriculture, say, in some drier parts of the country, the more the men from that state will move to urban areas. So climate change will speed up the pace of urbanization. It will change the role of women in society, or it will retard the change in the role. I mean, we would like to see women having an equal role at home and in the public space, but that will get retarded because of hardship, or like war retards an improvement in the status of women, because they then become the victims of war as well. And all of these are intersecting trends where women have more or less equal status, where they get more or less the same pay for the same work. You also have less violence against women. So in the Scandinavian countries, for instance, there is less threat to women in the public space. More or less they are equal. They are not quite equal, but more or less they are equal. But whereas in a country, I mean, like if you look at Delhi today, a girl is not able to walk out on the street after dark, not because in Delhi has the highest rate of rape or female molestation in the world, but because you feel threatened, because there have been some of these high profile cases, because young women have been targeted, and because there is so much of what police call eve teasing, but it's actually like a physical assault on a girl where you are physically manhandled. That will make a big difference. You just take this recent situation in Germany, what happened over the groping and harassment and physical assault on German women at the Cologne Cathedral. It has changed the whole discourse on refugees coming in from the Middle East. Whereas Germany was so welcoming, now it is talking about making it difficult for refugees to come, expelling any of the refugees who get caught doing anything criminal. So these are all things which interact with each other. Sorry, what was your second question?
Question regarding the unstable.
Yeah. So, there's no, I mean, in the old days, it would have been America, which was the policeman of the world kind of thing. Whether more stability would ensue after it has taken a decision and crushed a situation. But today they are all part of it. But that doesn't mean that the people themselves, that, the Arabs cannot come to some understanding. And a lot of this would die down if the Shia-Sunni differences, which have been exacerbated also deliberately, if those were to ameliorate, and they always do after a certain amount of time. After all, Shias and Sunnis have been around as long as there has been Islam in this region. They have not always been killing each other and fighting with each other in the way that they are doing now, and being provoked and funded, including by themselves. I mean, Saudi Arabia is also putting money in there. Iran has also been putting money in there. But these kinds of exacerbations, we have Hindu-Muslim differences in India, but then it settles down. So I'll just come to you. There's a question here.
Yes, ma'am, I actually had a question. With regards to Indo-China relations, everybody has read about this China's string of pearls strategy, like that they're investing in ports in like in Chittagong in Bangladesh, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and in Gwadar in Pakistan. Should India not be taking a more proactive role in countering this by devising its own so-called string of pearls in place like Vietnam, where we are already investing in oil, in those oil fields in the South China Sea or in Laos or in other countries, and have more such those like joint operate like in those military exercise like the Malabar exercise with Japan
Oh,
or
yeah,
US.
I mean, so let me say this. Always remember what I told you earlier. The size of your economy is 1/5 the size of the Chinese economy. The size of your budget, defense budget, is less than a third of what the, probably just about,
On the scale of
25% or something of the Chinese. So that determines what you can do. You can't buy a ship with nothing. So what you have done is you have always had a very close relationship with Vietnam. You have now tilted west in order to do these joint exercises with the Americans. You have become much closer to Australia than you were earlier. You are becoming very close to Japan. Now these actions are also provocative. China has constantly been complaining that everyone is ganging up against China. Does it have these ports in the Indian Ocean? Yes. But like Colombo argues, this is a commercial port. Hambantota at this time is a commercial port. Can it become something else? Yes, maybe it can. But if you look at the geography and the way maritime rivalries go, no one can challenge India's dominance in the Indian Ocean region. You can be challenged everywhere else. For instance, you have no real presence in the South China Sea, but you are also talking big over there. So by having these ports, yes, it will constrain India. But does India have options? Of course it has options. And those options include, say, like Chabahar, but then you must do it. So we cannot continue to say, oh, they are doing this, they are doing that. You have to have your own policy. And one final thing I would say to you is that don't only react to what somebody else is doing. We should pursue our own interest as we see it, see our own interest. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
You talked about the role of European countries in the Syrian crisis and the resultant refugee crisis that happened, and then the Paris attack happened, which led the France to drop bombs on Syria again. So this seems like a very vicious cycle. So do you think there is any way to break this cycle of violence?
Well, there are talks underway as you speak. It doesn't matter. It wasn't Syrian refugees who attacked Paris. Those were French citizens and whom France has not assimilated for generations. And those people came. There's a famous story about a Caribbean taxi driver in London, where one of the white Britishers said to him, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" He said, "Well, I'm here because you were there." So you have to remember that. That is why there are Muslim, people have migrated to UK or to France from their former colonies. This is the interactions that happen. No process is just one way. No road goes only one way. It works both ways. So yes, now increasing the bombing by the French, it's neither here nor there. The Americans have been bombing also in a very lackadaisical fashion. They pursue what is their interest. The Turks, for instance, they are quite happy that the Kurdish people are fighting the Islamic State because they have a Kurdish situation of their own. So they don't go and bomb Islamic State. They support what the Islamic State is doing. This will go on for some time till people in the region are able to feel and some kind of leadership emerges that they take their future into their own hands. India would have remained a colony unless an independence movement grew and Britain was weakened by the First and the Second World Wars. America would have remained a colony until they felt they could take on the British. So eventually it is really, what is called people's power. People have to decide. Now today the Middle Eastern people may feel that their only outlets are through terrorist organizations like Islamic State or something. But obviously they know better than that and they will come to that realization. Islam is today, everyone is talking about political Islam, Islamic fundamentalism. Islam is a religion just like any other. If you go to the holy books of Hinduism, of Islam, of Judaism, of the Bible, whatever it is, you will find the same quite unacceptable things being said about women. And this kind of thing, you can find them saying, kill the enemy. You can also find them saying that you must be compassionate to people who don't follow your path. You will find whatever you look for in religious texts.
No, I was just going to ask you whether you feel there's any sort of cultural differences which are perhaps responsible for these tensions, and that's perhaps the reason that all these immigrants are not able to assimilate, even though, there may be a more fundamental difference, and everyone says, no, they're the same, they're people like us. No, they're not the same. You refer to these texts right now. Of course, the New Testament says that, Old Testament says that if you see your neighbor working on Sunday, you should kill him. But no, nobody follows that literally. The difference is that here, if you see all these stoning incidents, for example, or right now in the Iranian president just met the French president, and they covered up these.
That was in Italy.
Yeah, so even when in Rome, they don't even when in Rome, it's not when in Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it shows you.
What kind of mindset is this?
Yeah,
that,
so it shows you what the Italian mindset is as well.
Yeah, okay, fine.
More than the Iranian, it seems to be.
Okay, fine.
You want their money, you will do anything. It's like when the British Queen used to visit. When the British Queen visited Saudi Arabia, she wore long sleeve dresses also. So let's get this straight. Everyone is chasing, contracts. Everyone is chasing for whatever money they can get. But I think your point is a very good point. I think we have to understand that social customs actually make the difference between different religious groups. The evolution of society, social custom in Europe has been a different trajectory than what has been going on in India or in the Middle East. The difference between India and Pakistan is not that is a majority Muslim country and this is a majority Hindu country. Between Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, you have a lot of similarity which you would be shocked by. Just as there is a lot of similarity between West Bengal and Bangladesh. Now, what happened in Europe and whether the refugees or earlier immigrants have been able to assimilate or not, to a great extent they had assimilated, but all processes take time. This lot of 1 million refugees have crossed over in a few months, 6, 7, 8 months. I don't know exactly, and I think we still have to wait to see what the outcomes is. It does seem that many of the new immigrants in Germany got together on social media, this is technology, and decided to do this kind of thing, what are called, thrusting at women. It's something that happened in Egypt earlier during their own uprisings. It does happen in other Middle Eastern countries as well. Is it the European tradition? No, it's not. But if you look at the way European traditions themselves are different between Catholic and Protestant regions. So southern Germany has quite different traditions, including for clothing that are followed. A lot of this is social conditioning. So if Middle Eastern men have gone to Germany and they have suddenly feel that they have this freedom, yes, I think it's totally condemnable. Could Indian men have done the same? Probably, in my opinion. So I think you have to understand that assimilation is something that happens over time. Most immigrants into European countries have actually assimilated quite well. Have those countries accepted the refugees and the immigrants that came in? Most have, not everybody has. That is why you have had the National Front in the UK, which wanted to expel all non-white people. You have Marine Le Pen in France, which would like to see all of them thrown out. You have, Trump in the United States, who says that all Muslims.
He says it should be a temporary ban. He doesn't say that it won't be.
Many of these things start as temporary, and then they.
He doesn't want a repeat of the same situation.
Let's see. I think
He has reasons for the same.
What can be these reasons? The Muslim community in America has not committed any of these things, and I think you need to watch on language also. Anyone who's interested in language will find that when there is an attack by a Christian, it's called an attack. It's militancy. If a Muslim is involved, it's a terrorism attack. If you look at what happens, I think in 6 months for 1 million refugees, most of whom are men, the majority are men, to have understood and accepted the customs of that country, not possible. And is this the most highly condemnable thing? Of course it is. Nobody would want it. You know, I'm a woman. I feel even more strongly about this than perhaps someone else might. But is it the case that France has treated its Muslim immigrants well? No, they are ghettoized in the periphery of Paris. Has the UK done better? Yeah, it has done better than France. Has the United States done better than the other countries? Much better than many of the European countries. You know, Denmark has passed a law 2 days ago that the refugees who come there and who are transiting actually to Sweden, they will take away all their valuables. I mean, you have to recognize this is the same Denmark which regarded itself, or Sweden for that matter, which used to say that it was a moral superpower. Look at its position on refugees now. One has to understand, these are all new trends. These are new for those people as they are the bombings and the killings and the continuous interference in the Middle East because of its oil wealth has been for the Arabs. So are the Arabs better than Europeans? No, they're just like them, but their social customs were different.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering. I think there were more than 10 questions and answering them so well and throwing light on all the global developments that have happened over the last 1 year. I'm sure we got a lot out of this talk. And before we let you go, we'd just like to present you a small memento for the new judges. Abhinav, please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone would like to interact more with ma'am, she
Certainly.
ma'am will be available outside, and to complete other formalities, please stay back. Abhinav and Kshitij will handle that. Thank you so much.
All of you, some of you would think about joining the Foreign Service as a career. It's a great career, and the Indian Foreign Service really needs legal acumen and legal training. So as far as the government, the Ministry of External Affairs would be concerned, it would be really a bonus for any of you to consider joining the Foreign Service. Thank you very much.